Hi there, Gwen again. And today I'm going to talk about boundaries. And this is the third in this is the second in a three video series that is introducing the circle I'm doing with Isabel Abbott called Body of Consent. And in the first video, I talked about consent itself and how sometimes it's very straightforward and sometimes, most often, it is incredibly complicated and complex, and there's intricacies to it. And today I'm going to talk about boundaries, and then in the next video I will talk about trauma and what it means, and resilience, and what it means to be in our bodies and living in a world and a culture and a society that that continues to traumatize us. But today is boundaries. So boundaries are something that I feel like is kind of, in some ways, is kind of a buzzword, right? Everybody talks about their boundaries, and I hear a lot of coaches talking about doing boundary work and and encouraging women, particularly women. It seems to be that's where most of the work is seen, is encouraging women to learn to say no and to and to be firm in that, and to be firm in what is acceptable, as far as treatment, as far as the way people speak to us, uh, speak about us, right? All of these things. And what doesn't really get talked about a lot is that we are our boundaries are a very physical thing. Well, we can talk about, saying no, right, to people who may or may not be taking advantage of us. While we can talk about saying no to overfilling our calendar. While we can talk about creating time for self-care and all of these other things. What I want to talk about is the actual embodiment of our boundaries, and how our body is very clear on what our boundaries are. That our boundaries are a very physical thing. And that includes, right, that includes the filling of our calendar, or the being taken advantage of by another person. It doesn't, when I say it's the embodiment, I don't necessarily mean a person standing too close to us and our bodies reacting to it, right? I'm talking about all aspects of we how we don't stand up for ourselves, how we don't listen to ourselves and our own knowing about what is okay for us in this moment. An exercise that I often give my clients is, it's called the string exercise. And what you do is you sit in the middle of the floor, a floor, and you have a string. It could be yarn, it could be string, it could be the bathrobe tie. I don't care what it is, right? It doesn't really matter. That you circle around you on the floor. And you move this string in and out as you think about different people or different situations. So the string is the physical marker of your boundaries with that person, with that situation, whatever it is. It's actually an exercise that I got from a book written by Peter Levine called Healing Trauma, and it's one of his exercises to really connect to your body and to connect to that sense of boundary and understanding. What is interesting about that is that our boundaries change, right? They are not written in stone. They are something that are flowing. They ebb and flow. They move. I know with my own husband, right? There are days that I really want to be physically close to him, and there are days when I want him to stay the fuck away from me, right? I mean, we all have that. There are days when I love cuddling my children, and there's days when I don't want them near me, right? In fact, there's moments when I want them really close, and then other moments within the same day that I'm like, I need some space, right? This is all normal. This is all normal, right? So having a boundary with a person, it's kind of permeable in some ways, in that it moves and it breathes and it's a living thing. And what I have noticed in my own lived experience and my work with other clients is that as our boundaries are respected, both by ourselves and by others, then they become more permeable. Like then it's okay. It's safe for people to come closer. It's safe because they've respected the boundary out here. So now they can come into here because they've proven to be trustworthy. This can be true in situations, right? In situations where we need to speak up for ourselves, for, I mean, whatever. It could be a business meeting, right? Where we need to speak up about some project that we're working on, and about some piece of it that's not working or is working, and here's why, right? That is part of boundary work too, right? Is that ability to speak and be heard, and to have our words be respected. It's not necessarily when we say yes, no, maybe, right? It's when we speak in general. I had a boss who, he was my boss, right? And I trusted him, because when I told him something wasn't working with work, he believed me, and he helped me problem solve, or he spearheaded the problem solving, depending on what was appropriate. And that was wonderful. And I trusted him beyond just work. I didn't really divulge many of my personal stories with him, but there was a level of trust there that was beyond him just being my boss. I've also had bosses who have completely disregarded everything I've said, and I wouldn't trust them, with anything about me or my life. So, right, um, that is also boundaries, right? When we're working with other people, and by working with other people, I mean interacting with other people in the world, because we're all in relationship, boundaries become slightly more complex, because one person's boundaries isn't necessarily another's. Just because I want to say yes to something doesn't mean another person is willing to say yes to it also. So at what point, right, are my boundaries more important than another person's? At what point is my unhappiness, my disappointment, my discomfort more important than another person's? There's not a straightforward answer there, right? There's not. Sometimes my discomfort is more important, right? For example, when I'm saying no and another person is saying yes, if I'm feeling uncomfortable and I'm saying no, 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 right? My no is more important than their yes. The opposite is also true. Someone else's no is more important than my yes, right? Their no, their discomfort is more important than my disappointment. And again, right? This all shifts given the situation, given the day, given the kind of day we're having, given how we're feeling, given, how we're feeling physically, given how we're feeling mentally, given, all of those things, right? And how this ties into our body and our embodiment is that we all have what is colloquially called spidey sense, right? We all have that sort of tingly knowing. And we're taught in our culture to ignore that because it's not based in logic, right? It's just a sense. Accept that, right? Our eyes and our hearing and our smell and our taste are all senses too, and it's okay to trust those. So, so that knowing sense, we're told not to trust, and that it's not important and it doesn't matter, and stuff it down and ignore it, and just keep doing the thing that you're supposed to be doing, whatever it is. I think we all have stories of having plans to do something, whatever, go on a trip, go to a party, go out to dinner, stay home, like, all these different things. And something in us said, no, don't do that thing. And we ignored it. And then something really shitty happened, whatever it was. Now, this is not to say that that's what we get for not listening to our sense, but it is to say that we ignore this sense at our own detriment, right? When I talked about the string exercise, so that is helping us tune into that physical knowing of boundaries. We know, our body knows, our mind also knows when our boundaries are being violated. We may not consciously know. It may not be like, oh, I know what's going on here, right? But we can start to have elevated heart rate. We can start to have challenged breathing. Our stomach can start to turn into knots. We can start to feel tense. Our throat can go dry, right? There's lots of physical responses that we have when our boundaries are being violated, either actually physically violated, someone's touching us and we don't want them to be, or more emotionally, someone's telling us what we should be doing with our lives and we didn't ask for their advice or opinions, right? That's a violation of boundary. And we react. I know that when I haven't asked for advice and someone starts giving me advice, I immediately get pissed off. I just get pissed. I'm like, I get really angry. And I know now what that anger response in me is, and it's because my boundary is being violated. I didn't ask for advice. I thought I wanted to be heard, and I'm not being heard, right? And so there's all the frustration, there's all that stuff that's going on. All of us have that response, whether it be anger, whether it be sort of a sadness that may come over us. It could be purely physical. We may not have an emotional response or be really aware of an emotional response. It could be purely physical, and that physical response may seem very muted. And the reason it's muted is because we've been trained not to listen to it, right? Not to hear it. So it's like it's screaming at us underwater kind of thing, right? And it's really muffled and we don't understand it. So as we do boundary work, I believe it is vitally important that we're doing work that connects us to our bodies, that we come into our bodies, that we start to listen to those tinglings and those twitches and those little muted rumblings, and when our stomach starts to clench and our throat starts to close, and all of those things that happen as a physical response when our boundary is being when a boundary is being violated, when our consent is being disregarded, when we are being disregarded. The more connected we are to our bodies, the more in our bodies we are, the better we can hear these things happening, and the more we can honor them. So it's kind of like a snowball effect, right? We start to we start to listen to our body, and then we start to honor what our body's saying, right? Our body says, hey, there's something wrong in this conversation. And we may not be able to consciously figure out what it is, like right in that moment. And that's okay. We can simply say, I need to end this conversation right now. I need to think about whatever's going on, whatever we're talking about. I need to take this offline for a bit, or, whatever your phrasing is, right? We can do that so that then we can process later. And that is a great way to honor our bodies, and our boundaries and our consent, is simply saying, you know what? I need to talk about this later. I can't do this right now. Most people will accept that, right? And if they won't accept that, and we've all been there, right? And I think we've all been on both sides of that, right? Um, then we can physically walk away, whatever that may look like, right? It may mean leaving a room. It may mean leaving your home. It may mean, it can mean all kinds of things, right? Depending on the situation. So the more we start to listen, and the more we start to then honor, right? Because hearing the twitches, hearing the spidey sense is one thing, and then honoring it is another, right? Then our body, we're able to hear more, right? And then we honor more, and then we're able to honor more, and then we're able to hear more, and honor more, hear more, and honor more. Now, the thing about the hearing more is that when our self, and I mean whole self, like body, mind, spirit, self, recognizes that we are going to listen and honor our boundaries, right? Then those twitches, which may be like really bad stomach aches, which might be headaches, which might be like really extreme dry throat, which may be, right? Which may turn into that once we get the mute off, right? They turn into like really loud. The more we listen, then the calmer they get. And it's not that they aren't there, they are there. And because our body and our mind know that we're going to listen, they don't scream as loud, right? So chronic headaches may go away, right? I know that every time I would go home to visit my dad years ago, that I would get the worst fucking headache on the day that I was going to meet with him. Like, it would get awful, and it would get progressively worse while I was at his house. Now, that headache actually had nothing to do with my father and everything to do with my stepmother, because all she did was trample on boundaries. All she did was push beyond what was acceptable for me in talking about me and my life. And once I figured that out, like, oh, I actually don't want to be around this woman, right? It was a big game changer. There's a whole other complicated story with that. But the point being that then I didn't get the headaches anymore. I also made an effort to see my dad without my stepmom. That had its own issues, but that's another story. But the fact that I was now listening to myself and acknowledging, yeah, I really hate dealing with that woman, right? Then all my senses could kind of soothe themselves a little bit. Trauma is a big piece of this too, and I'll talk about that in the next video. It's a big piece of this and how that impacts our boundaries and our consent. So, but that is all on boundaries for now. I hope you enjoyed this, and Again, this is part of an introduction to the 6-month circle with Isabel Abbott called Body of Consent. And there's a link down there at the bottom. If it's in YouTube, if you're viewing this in YouTube, it's down in the description thing. And if you're viewing this embedded on my website, it's underneath the video box. Okay, sending you love, and I will see you again in a few days.